At that altitude, the sky belonged to them. Years of war had taught German fighter pilots a simple truth: whoever held the height controlled the fight. From above, they watched the enemy climb, slowly straining engines' fragile silhouettes inching upward into air that punished weakness. This was where the Luftwaffe had always ruled: precision, experience, gravity itself as an ally. Then something unfamiliar appeared in the formation below. It did not look right. Too broad in the wings, too thick in the body. It climbed without elegance, without urgency, as if unaware of the danger waiting above. To seasoned German eyes, it was an insult to everything air combat demanded. A machine built by people who did not yet understand this sky. The first attacks followed instinct. A dive from the sun, cannons firing, the kind of strike that usually ended a fight in seconds. But when the smoke cleared, the expected wreckage did not fall. The aircraft staggered, shuddered, and kept flying. At first, it was dismissed as luck. Then it happened again and again. Reports began to circulate through squadrons and briefing rooms, quiet at first, almost embarrassed. Pilots spoke of American fighters that refused to break apart, that absorbed punishment and escaped downward with impossible speed. Something had changed, not in German skill, but in the nature of the enemy they faced. And an unspoken question began to settle into the thin, icy air above Europe. What happens when the machine you were taught to underestimate is the one that no longer obeys the rules of the sky? For the Luftwaffe, the early years of the war had forged an unshakable confidence. From Poland to France, from the Channel Coast to the skies over Britain, German fighter pilots had learned to think of altitude as ownership. Height meant choice. Height meant survival. It allowed them to decide when to strike and when to disengage, to turn the sky itself into a weapon. Experience reinforced that belief. Many of these men had survived dozens, even hundreds of engagements. They trusted their instincts, their machines, and the doctrine that had carried them this far. American air power, by contrast, was viewed with a quiet contempt. When U.S. aircraft first appeared in meaningful numbers over Europe, German pilots noted their shortcomings immediately. The fighters were new, their formations rigid, their pilots cautious. Most telling of all, the machines themselves seemed to misunderstand the demands of the air war over Europe. They were heavier than expected, less graceful, and appeared to sacrifice agility for something no one could quite identify as useful. When the first examples of the new American fighter entered the fight, the judgment came swiftly. It was too large to dogfight, too slow to dictate terms, too cumbersome to survive against veterans who had mastered vertical combat. In briefing rooms and mess halls, Luftwaffe pilots spoke of it as a temporary inconvenience, a transitional design that would be replaced once the Americans learned their lesson. Early encounters seemed to confirm every assumption. German fighters could outturn it. At lower altitudes, they could outclimb it. In close combat, the American aircraft avoided prolonged engagements, diving away instead of pressing the fight. To German eyes, this was interpreted not as discipline, but as weakness, a lack of confidence, a sign that the enemy knew his machine was inferior. Losses during those months reinforced a dangerous sense of certainty. When American formations broke under pressure, when escorts failed to protect bombers, Luftwaffe pilots believed they were witnessing a familiar pattern. Newcomers learning the hard way. Machines built for a different kind of war, now exposed to the unforgiving reality of European skies. Yet beneath that confidence, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Gun camera footage showed enemy aircraft returning to base with damage that should have been fatal. Pilots reported firing long bursts, seeing hits land cleanly, only to watch the American fighter dive away intact. These reports were often dismissed. Combat was chaotic, perception unreliable. Luck explained everything that doctrine could not. Still, the pattern persisted. What unsettled experienced pilots was not that the American fighter avoided turning battles, but that it did so deliberately. It chose speed over elegance. It chose survival over victory in the moment. Each escape felt incomplete, like a problem left unsolved. The enemy was not being destroyed, only postponed. At first, this was interpreted as a flaw that time would punish. But war has little patience for assumptions. And as weeks turned into months, the Luftwaffe began to realize that the Americans were not failing to fight properly. They were fighting differently. And in that difference lay the first cracks in the certainty that had once made the sky feel like home. The change did not announce itself with a decisive battle or a dramatic shift on a map. It arrived quietly through repetition. Engagement after engagement, German pilots found themselves facing an opponent that refused to behave as expected. The American fighter did not circle. It did not linger. It did not chase glory in tight turns where experience usually decided everything. Instead, it climbed higher than anticipated and waited. From above, the attack came with startling violence. The American fighter dropped out of the sun, converting altitude into speed with a force that compressed time itself. There was no warning spiral, no gradual closing of distance. One moment the sky was empty. The next it was filled with tracer fire and shock. Before a German pilot could respond, the attacker was already gone, tearing downward into thinner air where pursuit became futile. At first, this tactic felt crude. It lacked finesse. It violated the unwritten code of fighter combat that valued maneuver intuition and nerve. But it worked. Again and again, German pilots found their carefully planned interceptions disrupted by sudden overwhelming strikes from above. The fight no longer unfolded on familiar terms. It ended before it could begin. What disturbed them most was not the aggression, but the resilience. Hits that should have crippled the American aircraft failed to do so. Cannon shells struck wings and fuselage, yet the enemy kept flying. Engines sputtered, airframes shuddered, but the fighter continued its dive, gaining speed as though damage only fed its momentum. Chasing it downward was pointless. The aircraft fell faster than physics seemed to allow, leaving German fighters gasping for air and control. Briefings grew tense. Veterans began speaking more carefully. The Americans, they said, were not winning by skill in the traditional sense. They were imposing a different geometry on the sky, one built around altitude, speed, and endurance. Each encounter followed the same pattern: a sudden descent, a concentrated burst of fire, and an escape that denied retaliation. It was not a duel, it was a method. As these encounters multiplied, confidence eroded. Pilots accustomed to controlling the rhythm of combat now reacted instead of dictated. Every climb felt exposed. Every formation seemed vulnerable from above. The enemy did not need to destroy every aircraft. It only needed to survive long enough to return again unchanged in purpose, relentless in execution. Some German pilots adapted, attempting to lure the Americans into lower altitudes where their advantages diminished. Others pressed harder, determined to force a traditional engagement. Too often, those efforts ended the same way, with a brief flash of gunfire and an enemy already gone. What the Luftwaffe was facing was not a superior dogfighter, but something more unsettling. A machine designed to fight on its own terms, backed by a doctrine that valued consistency over flair. Each failed interception reinforced the same realization. The sky was no longer a place of mastery. It was becoming a place of uncertainty. The moment that shattered remaining certainty did not arrive as a decisive victory. It arrived as a survival that should not have been possible. On a morning in June 1943, German fighters intercepted an American formation crossing the French coast. The conditions were ideal. Altitude advantage, sun position, numbers, everything the Luftwaffe had relied upon for years aligned once more. The attack unfolded with practiced precision, cannon fire stitching across the sky, closing in on a single American aircraft that lagged behind the formation. From the German perspective, the outcome was beyond doubt. The enemy fighter was torn open, glass shattered, control surfaces buckled, smoke streamed from the fuselage. Blood was visible in the cockpit. This was not combat anymore, it was an execution. And yet the aircraft did not fall. Even after a lone German fighter moved in close and emptied its remaining ammunition into the wounded machine, the American fighter refused to break apart. It staggered forward, barely controlled, descending toward the channel with a stubbornness that defied every known rule of air combat. What should have been wreckage became distance. What should have been certainty became disbelief. When intelligence reports later confirmed that the pilot had survived and that ground crews had counted more than 200 impacts on the aircraft, the effect inside the Luftwaffe was profound. This was no longer a matter of tactics or luck. It was a structural truth. The enemy's machine could absorb punishment that German aircraft simply could not. Soon after came a second blow, quieter, but far more symbolic. At high altitude, where experience had once compensated for any disadvantage, German aces began to fall. Among them was Hans Philipp, a pilot whose career represented everything the Luftwaffe believed about mastery of the air. His loss was not explained by surprise or recklessness. It was explained by physics. The American fighters arrived from above with speed he could not match and left before he could respond. For commanders, these events demanded answers. Investigations followed. Technical assessments piled up. The conclusions were grim. At altitude, German engines lost power while the American fighter remained strong. Its structure endured damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Its firepower delivered in concentrated bursts left little room for survival. The implications were impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe was not simply losing aircraft. It was losing the conditions under which it knew how to fight. From that point forward, every engagement carried an undercurrent of doubt. Pilots still climbed, still intercepted, still fought with skill and courage, but the assurance that once defined German air power was gone. Each sortie now carried a question that could not be answered in the briefing room. Not how to win the fight, but whether the fight could be controlled at all. From the German side of the sky, the most unsettling realization was not the performance of a single American fighter, but the system that sustained it. What Luftwaffe pilots encountered was not an isolated threat, but a pattern, one that repeated with mechanical reliability. Losses inflicted one day were undone the next. Aircraft destroyed in the morning were replaced by afternoon. Squadrons that should have been weakened returned with the same strength, the same discipline, the same confidence. To German commanders, this revealed a deeper asymmetry. American air power was not built around individual brilliance or battlefield improvisation. It was built around endurance. Behind every fighter in the sky stood factories that never paused training programs, that produced pilots in waves and logistics networks, that treated attrition as a variable, to be managed, not a catastrophe to be feared. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was fighting a war of exhaustion without the reserves to sustain it. This imbalance became impossible to ignore as the war progressed into 1944. German pilots entering combat increasingly lacked the experience of their fallen predecessors. Training hours were cut. Fuel was rationed. Replacement aircraft arrived too slowly, often inferior to what they replaced. Meanwhile, American units arrived with pilots who had logged hundreds of hours flown in formation until it became instinct and trusted machines that were maintained with an abundance of spare parts and skilled ground crews. Nowhere was this contrast more visible than during the Allied invasion of Normandy. From the German perspective, the sky itself appeared layered with American aircraft. Fighters patrolled at every altitude, leaving no safe corridor for interception. Attempts to challenge this presence were brief and costly. A single American fighter could devastate a column of vehicles or sever a supply line in moments. What had once been an air force contesting control of the skies was now an air force struggling simply to survive beneath them. To the wider world, the meaning was clear, even if the cost was borne unevenly. Air superiority was no longer achieved through daring alone. It was constructed through production training and relentless operational pressure. The Americans did not seek decisive aerial duels. They sought continuity. Every mission flown, every target struck, every aircraft returned to service tightened a grip that could not be shaken by isolated successes. From the Luftwaffe's vantage point, this transformation was devastating precisely because it left no obvious solution. Courage could not compensate for fuel shortages. Experience could not overcome physics. Tactical ingenuity could not defeat an enemy whose strength regenerated faster than it could be depleted. The sky, once a domain shaped by skill and instinct, had become a reflection of industrial power and strategic patience. By the time German leaders fully grasped this reality, it was already too late. The war in the air had moved beyond the reach of individual pilots and into the realm of systems, and there the outcome was no longer in doubt. For the Luftwaffe, the final months of the war brought a silence that felt unfamiliar. The skies over Europe, once crowded with constant motion and sudden violence, grew quieter not because the danger had passed, but because the struggle for control had already been decided. What remained was the slow recognition that the air war had moved beyond the reach of individual skill. The American fighter that had once drawn ridicule never needed to become elegant. It did not have to outturn its enemies or impress them with finesse. It endured, it returned, and it came back again unchanged in purpose. For German pilots, the realization was deeply unsettling. They had trained for a world where mastery of the machine and sharp instincts could still tip the balance. Instead, they found themselves facing an opponent whose strength lay not in brilliance, but in inevitability. This was the true legacy of the Thunderbolt, as seen from the losing side. It represented a form of warfare in which courage remained essential but insufficient, where victories were no longer measured by isolated triumphs, but by the ability to sustain pressure day after day. The Luftwaffe did not collapse because its pilots lost their nerve or their skill. It collapsed because the conditions that once rewarded those qualities no longer existed. What history teaches us. From a historical perspective, the air war over Europe reveals three lessons that extend far beyond the cockpit. First, technology alone does not decide wars. The Thunderbolt was powerful, but its true strength came from the system behind it. Training programs, logistics, maintenance, and production capacity working in unison. Without that foundation, even the most advanced machine becomes vulnerable. Second, adaptation matters more than tradition. The Luftwaffe entered the war with unmatched experience and doctrine shaped by early victories. But when the environment changed altitude, numbers, endurance, those traditions became liabilities. History shows that forces which fail to adapt often do not realize their disadvantage until it is irreversible. Finally, modern warfare rewards endurance over brilliance. Individual skill can shape moments, but systems shape outcomes. The ability to replace losses, learn from failure, and apply pressure consistently prove more decisive than any single ace or engagement. Today, when we study these aircraft in museums, it is easy to focus on specifications, victories, or famous names. But the deeper value lies in understanding why one side prevailed. The Thunderbolt story reminds us that wars are not only fought by heroes in the sky, but by societies capable of sustaining effort over time. And perhaps that is the most important lesson for future generations. Strength is not defined solely by speed or agility, but by preparation, resilience, and the willingness to learn before circumstances force the lesson upon us. In your opinion, what historical lessons from this air war are still relevant to the modern world? Please share your thoughts in the comments.